It was a typical Tuesday evening when Tasha's world suddenly flipped upside down. She'd just wrapped up a long day of work at the community center and was on her way home, her mind focused on the routine tasks that awaited her, helping her daughter with homework, preparing dinner, maybe catching up on some of the latest news. The streets were quiet, the kind of peaceful calm that made the town feel almost timeless. She couldn't know it then, but this seemingly normal evening would change everything for her. As she turned onto a quieter street near her home, the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror jolted her into alertness. The sudden brightness, cutting through the night, made her heart race. Tasha, a woman who had spent years carefully navigating life as a black woman in a small town, immediately felt that familiar pang of unease. She had been stopped by the police before, but something felt different this time. She slowed her car, rolling down the window and bracing herself for the interaction. Her hands, steady but tense, gripped the wheel as she watched the two officers approach her vehicle. The sound of their boots on the pavement was loud in the otherwise silent night. Tasha's mind flicked back to the countless times she had read about other people's unfortunate encounters with law enforcement, anxiety bubbling to the surface, even though she had always tried to keep a clean record and be a model citizen. Still, she couldn't help but wonder why she had been stopped this time. The first officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an expression that seemed more weary than anything else, leaned toward her window. He asked for her license and registration with the dull professionalism Tasha had grown used to. But something about his tone, something in the way his eyes scanned her face, felt off. He didn't sound like he was here to write a ticket, or at least not one for speeding or a simple traffic violation. He paused for a moment, just long enough for Tasha to notice it, before his partner, a younger, less experienced officer, stood slightly behind him, watching her intently. Tasha instinctively shifted in her seat, trying to make sense of the strange tension building in the air. "Ma'am, can I ask you to step out of the car for a moment?" the older officer said, his voice tinged with a faint but undeniable unease. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a request she was used to hearing in situations like this. It was still early in the evening, the streets were well lit, and she hadn't done anything wrong. She knew the law, and she knew she had the right to ask why she was being treated this way. But in that moment, something told her not to push back, at least not yet. She nodded, unbuckling her seatbelt and opening the door slowly. She kept her movements calm, her face a mask of composure, though inside she was already weighing her options. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. The older officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. Tasha could see the uncertainty in his eyes, and it made her nervous. The younger officer, whose name she couldn't yet make out from his badge, was watching her with an intensity that felt personal. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't looking at her just as a citizen, there was something more to this interaction. "We need to check something," the officer finally said, his tone almost apologetic. But Tasha didn't feel reassured. Her mind was already racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had been stopped many times before, but this felt different. Her senses were on high alert, every instinct screaming that this encounter wasn't going to be a simple traffic stop. As she stood by her car, the night air crisp against her skin, Tasha felt the weight of the moment settle in. She knew she was about to be part of something bigger than herself, something that would shake her own perception of what it meant to hold power in a community that had never fully accepted her. It was a small town, after all, where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. And Tasha, for all her efforts to be a quiet, hard-working mother, had recently become a figure that few could ignore. Unbeknownst to these officers, she wasn't just any woman standing on the side of the road that night. She was the newly appointed chief of police in the neighboring town, a role she had earned after years of hard work, community activism, and navigating the intricate politics of law enforcement. Tasha had always been passionate about reforming the system from within, but her appointment had been met with resistance by many, and most of the town's police officers had no idea who she truly was. In that split second, the officers were completely unaware that they were about to confront the very person they would later have to answer to. It was a reality that, at the time, felt like it was happening to someone else, but Tasha knew it wasn't. This was her moment to stand firm, to assert her right to be seen not just as a woman of color but as a leader, one who was ready to challenge the systems that had once made her feel invisible. The older officer asked her for her identification, which she handed over without hesitation. But when he ran the information through his system, a silence settled over the two officers. Tasha watched the realization slowly dawn on their faces, as they pieced together who she was. The younger officer, wide-eyed, took a step back. The older officer muttered something under his breath, almost inaudible. But Tasha could hear it. He was confused. And it was in that moment of confusion that the first crack appeared in the armor of their professionalism. "Wait a minute, you're the new chief," the younger officer stammered. Tasha didn't answer immediately. She just looked at them, her gaze steady. She could see it now, the unease, the hesitation. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her. The realization struck like lightning. The awkward silence between them stretched longer than it should have, and for the first time, Tasha felt the full weight of what had just happened. The traffic stop, which had felt like any other stop moments before, was no longer just a simple misunderstanding. It was a confrontation with the very institution she was now a part of. And this moment, this encounter, would mark the beginning of a transformation that none of them were ready for. The older officer, still visibly shaken, cleared his throat and took a step back. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience," he muttered, fumbling for words. "You can go on your way. We'll clear this up." But Tasha, standing tall, wasn't sure if this was the end of the matter, or if it was just the beginning. As she returned to her car, the officers stood in the dim glow of the streetlight, exchanging glances, still processing what had just happened. Tasha slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel once more, but this time, it wasn't with unease, it was with a sense of quiet resolve. She wasn't just driving home anymore. She was driving towards something much bigger, something that would change the course of her life, and the lives of everyone in her community. The night was still, the kind of quiet that often follows a storm. Tasha's heart continued to race, but now, there was something else, an overwhelming mix of disbelief and realization. She drove the familiar streets toward her home, but everything seemed different. She was hyper-aware of every turn, every sound, the subtle hum of her car's engine, the occasional rustle of the wind, the soft flicker of streetlights. She glanced in the rearview mirror, and the image of the two officers, standing there, looking at her as if she were an enigma, stuck with her. She had known that day would come. She had known that she would eventually have to face the reality of her role as the first black woman to hold the position of chief of police in a nearby town. But she hadn't expected it to come in the form of an ordinary traffic stop on a Tuesday night. Tasha wasn't born into this kind of power. She had come from humble beginnings, growing up in the town of Wilkinsville, a small, almost forgotten place that didn't make the headlines often. She had been raised by her grandmother, who worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet, instilling in Tasha the values of hard work and perseverance. Tasha was a good student, the kind of person who never looked for shortcuts but always found a way to succeed through determination. She had earned scholarships to go to college, and after graduation, she returned to Wilkinsville, hoping to give back to the community that had shaped her. For years, she had worked in social services, advocating for families who struggled, becoming a trusted voice in the community. But over time, Tasha realized that real change didn't just come from outside, it had to come from within the systems that perpetuated inequality. She knew she could make a difference, and that was how she found herself on the path toward becoming a police chief. The road had been difficult. The political machine in Wilkinsville was entrenched, dominated by old attitudes and an unwillingness to change. Many people had their doubts about her. Some questioned whether a woman could lead such an institution. Others, particularly those in law enforcement, believed a woman of color would never have the experience, the authority, or the respect to take charge. But Tasha had proved them wrong. After years of pushing for police reform and building relationships with the community, she had earned her place, against all odds. The day she was appointed was one of the proudest moments of her life. She had done it. But tonight, she was confronted with the stark reality that some were still unwilling to accept the changes she represented. As she pulled into her driveway, the weight of what had just happened hit her. She turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, the soft ticking of the car cooling in the still night air. Tasha thought about what had just transpired, the officers' faces, the confusion, the hesitation. She had known that she would face resistance, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was the discomfort of a system that had for so long excluded voices like hers, and now, her presence was unsettling to those who felt entitled to control it. Tasha wasn't naive enough to think that everyone in the town, or even within the department, was on board with the changes she was trying to implement. But this moment, the look of shock on the officers' faces, made it all too clear that her position was more than just a job. It was a symbol. And that symbol was being tested in real time. She sat there for a long time, staring at the house in front of her, the home she had worked so hard to provide for her daughter, the sanctuary that had always felt like her safe place. But even this comfort felt distant now. She wasn't just Tasha, the mom, the community worker anymore. She was Tasha, the chief of police, the first black woman to hold the position in this county, and that came with responsibilities, expectations, and burdens she had never fully prepared for. She thought of her daughter, who was waiting for her inside, unaware of what had just happened. The weight of the conversation that would come tomorrow morning loomed over her. How could she explain this to a child who had never seen the complexities of the world the way Tasha had? How could she shield her from the ugliness that she knew would inevitably surface? Tasha got out of the car and walked toward the front door, her steps slow and deliberate. She had to process this. She had to figure out what to do next. The confrontation with the officers had shaken her, but it also lit a fire. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for the community that was watching her every move. She had to prove that she wasn't just a token of change, that she was capable of being the leader they needed. When she entered the house, her daughter was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in her lap. She looked up at Tasha with a bright smile, oblivious to the storm that had just passed over her mother's life. Tasha forced a smile back, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She dropped her purse on the kitchen counter and sat down beside her daughter, running a hand through her hair, trying to find the words to say. "How was your day, sweetie?" Tasha asked, her voice soft, trying to keep her own emotions in check. "It was okay," her daughter replied, glancing up at her with curiosity. "What's wrong, Mom? You seem off." Tasha took a deep breath. She didn't want to burden her daughter with the weight of the world yet, but she knew it was coming. She had always been honest with her, teaching her the value of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. But how could she explain to her daughter the complexities of her world, of the challenges she was facing right now as a mother and as the first black female police chief in a small town? Before she could answer, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her best friend, Carla, a fellow activist who had supported Tasha throughout her campaign for police reform. Tasha opened the message, reading it quickly. "I saw the news. Are you okay? The town's already talking. Be ready. It's only going to get worse from here." Tasha sighed, her fingers lingering on the screen. Carla was right. The news would spread fast, maybe even before she had a chance to process it herself. The people in Wilkinsville were not ready for a leader like her, and the tension would only rise as the weeks went on. What had started as a simple misunderstanding during a routine traffic stop was now a symbol of the deep divisions in her town, divisions that she had hoped to heal, but now felt like they were only getting deeper. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. First black woman appointed police chief in Wilkinsville faces unexpected controversy. The weight of the situation crashed down on her. She had always known that taking on this role would mean facing opposition, but seeing it unfold in real time was different. It felt personal now. This wasn't just about reform, it was about her. And it was about how the world saw her. Tasha knew that the next few days, weeks, maybe even months would be filled with challenges. But she had come this far by standing firm in the face of adversity. She wasn't going to back down now. Not for the officers. Not for the town. And definitely not for herself. Her daughter looked up at her again, noticing the change in her mother's demeanor. Tasha smiled, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, more for herself than for her daughter. The battle ahead would be long, but Tasha knew she couldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The next few days were a blur for Tasha. The incident with the police officers quickly became the talk of Wilkinsville, and what had initially seemed like a simple misunderstanding was now a firestorm that threatened to consume everything she had worked for. The town's small, tightly knit community was split down the middle. Half the residents were defending her, hailing her as a symbol of progress, while the other half viewed her as an outsider, unworthy of the role she had fought so hard to attain. The town's long history of racial tensions bubbled to the surface, as if it had been waiting for a spark. Tasha knew the moment she accepted the position as chief of police that she would face challenges, but nothing could have prepared her for the full force of the backlash. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, some of support, but many of scorn. Friends, allies, and even strangers weighed in on her appointment, but there was one message that stood out among the rest. It was from her own mother, a woman whose wisdom had always been a guiding light in Tasha's life. She hadn't heard from her mother since the appointment, and Tasha had been avoiding the conversation, knowing how her mother might feel about her taking such a controversial position in law enforcement. The text was short, but it cut deep. "You're playing with fire, Tasha. Be careful. I know you want to change things, but don't forget who you are." Tasha stared at the screen for a long time, the words lingering in her mind. She had always respected her mother's perspective, even when it conflicted with her own. Growing up, her mother had taught her to be cautious, to pick her battles wisely, and to know when to stand back and let others take the lead. But Tasha's heart had always pushed her in a different direction. She wasn't one to sit on the sidelines, especially when the stakes were so high. The message made her pause, but it also made her more determined to prove that she was capable of bringing about the change she had promised. That afternoon, Tasha called a meeting with her senior officers. The department, much like the town itself, was divided. Some of the officers had supported her appointment, believing in her vision for reform and seeing her leadership as a step toward progress. Others, particularly the older, more entrenched members of the department, resented her position and openly questioned her qualifications. Tasha had always known there would be tension, but this was something else. This was a battle for respect, for authority, and for the very soul of the department. When Tasha entered the room for the meeting, the atmosphere was thick with skepticism. Several officers sat around the large table, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright disdain. The younger officers, who had been more receptive to her ideas, sat toward the back, glancing at each other nervously. Tasha cleared her throat, standing at the front of the room. "Listen up, everyone," she began, her voice steady but carrying an edge of authority. "I know things are tense right now, and I know there are questions. But we need to face the facts. This department is at a crossroads, and it's going to take all of us to move forward. There's a lot of work to do, and we're going to do it together, whether we like it or not." The room was silent. Tasha could feel the weight of every eye on her. She continued, trying to steady her nerves. "I'm here because I believe in change. I believe in this community, and I believe that we can do better. But I need you to believe that, too. We can't afford to be divided. If we're going to rebuild trust with the people we serve, we have to start with each other. That means no more division, no more doubt, and no more questioning each other's intentions." The silence lingered for a moment before one of the senior officers, Officer Jenkins, cleared his throat. He was in his mid-50s, a man whose career spanned decades. His reputation in the department was one of unwavering loyalty to the old ways, and he had never been shy about voicing his opinions. "Chief," he began, his tone calculated but respectful, "I think we all understand the importance of reform. But this," he motioned to her, a gesture that seemed to encompass not just her but everything she represented, "this is going to take time. The people in this town, many of them don't trust the changes you're pushing. And honestly, neither do I." Tasha held his gaze, not flinching. "I didn't take this job to be liked, Officer Jenkins," she replied calmly. "I took it because it was necessary. Change is hard, and I know that. But it's not optional anymore. It's time we started treating our community like partners, not just suspects." The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, Tasha thought Jenkins was going to push back further. Instead, he sighed, looking down at the table. "I respect what you're trying to do, Chief. But I don't think you understand what you're up against." Tasha stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "I understand more than you think, Jenkins. I've spent my entire life watching people like me get overlooked, underappreciated, and dismissed. I know exactly what I'm up against. And I'm not backing down." There was a long pause, and then Jenkins nodded slowly, as if conceding the point. The room was still tense, but something in Tasha's words seemed to shift the atmosphere. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her. She wasn't going to let the history of this department, or the people who had been in it for decades, define her. She was going to lead this department in the direction she knew it needed to go, whether they liked it or not. As the meeting continued, Tasha found herself surrounded by mixed reactions. Some officers seemed to be thawing, even agreeing to certain initiatives she proposed, while others remained skeptical. But one thing was clear, Tasha wasn't going to back down. She would keep fighting, keep pushing, and keep leading by example. The road ahead was going to be difficult. It wasn't just about changing policies or procedures, it was about changing the culture, and that kind of transformation would take time. But Tasha had always believed that the hardest battles were the ones worth fighting. And if there was one thing she had learned over the years, it was that nothing worth having came easily. The next few weeks saw an intensifying of the debate surrounding her leadership. Media outlets, both local and national, picked up the story, and it quickly became a point of contention in the larger conversation about police reform in America. Tasha's every move was scrutinized, from her policy decisions to her interactions with the community. And with every new challenge, the pressure mounted. But she knew one thing for certain, she couldn't let the opinions of others dictate her path. This was her journey, and if she had to go through hell to make a difference, she would. She continued to push for the changes she had promised, meeting with community leaders, listening to residents, and working to foster a relationship of trust between the police department and the people they served. There were successes, small, quiet victories that didn't make the headlines but meant the world to the families they impacted. But there were also setbacks, backlash from some of the town's most vocal critics, resistance from within the department, and the constant pressure of being the first black woman in this role. But through it all, Tasha remained resolute. The road ahead would not be easy, and there would be moments of doubt, frustration, and exhaustion. But she knew one thing, change was inevitable. And she was going to make sure it happened. The days turned into weeks, and the weight of the position, the constant scrutiny, and the high expectations were beginning to wear on Tasha. She had known that being the first black woman to lead the police department would make her a target, but the reality of it was far more exhausting than she could have imagined. Every public appearance, every decision she made, was dissected, questioned, and critiqued. She could feel the pressure mounting with every passing day. Even in her own department, where she had once thought she could count on support, she found herself standing alone more often than not. Officers who had been friendly and open during her early days on the job were now distant, reluctant to engage with her outside of the necessary tasks. The tension in the department was palpable, and she knew that more than just policies needed to change, hearts and minds were what she was truly up against. Tasha spent long hours at work, attending endless meetings and dealing with the immediate fallout of every policy she tried to implement. It seemed that for every inch of progress she made, there were 2 steps backward. Community outreach programs, designed to build trust between the police and the residents, were met with suspicion. She had hoped that by listening to the people, by hearing their concerns, she could pave the way for a new kind of relationship between law enforcement and the community. But there was a deep-seated distrust that ran far deeper than Tasha had initially understood. The town of Wilkinsville had a long history of racial tension, and no matter how many hours she spent in meetings or walking door to door, the scars of the past were not easily erased. Her first few months in office were also marked by a series of incidents that tested her resolve. A series of protests broke out in the town after a controversial police-related shooting in a neighboring city. Though Wilkinsville was not directly involved, the community erupted with anger and frustration, and the police department was once again thrust into the spotlight. Tasha found herself walking a fine line between maintaining law and order while trying to show that she was on the side of the people. The last thing she wanted was to escalate the situation further, but as tensions flared, there were moments when the department's tactics and response felt out of sync with the principles she was trying to instill. During one of the protests, things got heated. A group of demonstrators, many of whom were young, frustrated, and full of anger, faced off with officers in riot gear. Tasha had attended the protest, hoping to show solidarity and understand the grievances of the people. But what she saw was something she hadn't anticipated: the visceral hatred in the eyes of the protesters, the frustration that had been building for years finally bubbling over. As she walked along the edge of the crowd, a young man, barely out of his teens, stepped forward and pointed directly at her. "You don't belong here," he shouted, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just part of the problem, another face of the system that's been crushing us for years." The words hit Tasha like a physical blow. She was used to being scrutinized by her peers, but this was different. This was personal. He was right, she was part of the system. The very system she had spent years trying to reform. She had always seen herself as an ally to the community, but in that moment, she realized that some people, perhaps many, didn't see her that way. They saw her as just another figurehead, someone who had traded her identity for a badge. She felt like an outsider in a town that was supposed to be her home, where she had grown up, and where she had once fought to make a difference in people's lives. In that moment, as the protesters shouted and the tension in the air became almost unbearable, Tasha made a decision. She knew she couldn't fight this battle with words alone. She had to show the community, in the most profound way, that she was different, that she wasn't just the face of the police, but someone who truly understood their pain. She stepped up to the front of the crowd and raised her hand for silence. Slowly, the shouting died down, though the air was still thick with tension. "I know you're angry," she said, her voice trembling, not from fear but from the weight of the situation. "I know the trust has been broken. I know many of you see me as just another cop who won't change anything. But I'm not just any cop. I'm the chief of police. And I'm here to tell you that I am listening. I know things are messed up. I know we have a long way to go, but I'm not going to sit back and let it stay this way. We will fix this together. I promise you, we will fix this." It wasn't a perfect speech. It wasn't even a particularly eloquent one. But it was real. And for the first time since taking on the role, Tasha felt as though she had said something that resonated with the crowd. There was no immediate eruption of applause, but there was a shift. The protesters, many of them young people who had been yelling just moments before, now looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Tasha knew that this moment, as small as it seemed, was a turning point. The days following that protest were full of tension, but they were also full of small victories. Tasha began holding regular town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns, not just about the police but about anything that affected their lives. Slowly, the department began to work more closely with community leaders, collaborating on initiatives aimed at reducing crime and improving public safety without the heavy-handed tactics that had defined the department for so long. Tasha's leadership style was slowly being accepted by those who had once doubted her, and though there was still a long way to go, she could see the cracks in the old system starting to form. One evening, Tasha received a call from a local business owner who had been part of the protest. His voice was gruff but calm when he spoke. "Chief, I don't know what you did out there last week, but I want you to know that I'm with you. The people in this town, they just want to be heard. They want someone who gets it. You're not perfect, and I'm not saying everything you do will work. But I can see you're trying. And that's more than anyone else has done in years." It wasn't the kind of message she had expected, but it was the kind of message she needed. It reminded her that change, however small, was still change. She wasn't going to be able to turn everything around overnight, but each step forward, no matter how small, was progress. Over the next several months, Tasha's commitment to reform became more and more evident. She brought in new programs, focused on building relationships with marginalized communities, and worked tirelessly to change the culture within the department. But despite the strides she made, the road was never easy. There were always naysayers, always those who thought she was trying to change too much too fast. She was often forced to make difficult decisions that pitted her against both the police force and the very community she was trying to protect. But one thing was certain, she was no longer just fighting for a job. She was fighting for a future. And with each small victory, she grew more and more confident that the road she was walking was the right one, no matter how hard it seemed. As Tasha lay in bed one night, reflecting on how far she had come, she received another message, this time from a local activist who had once been one of her harshest critics. The message was brief, but it carried more weight than any of the others: "Keep going. We're behind you." Tasha smiled, knowing that the road ahead was still full of challenges, but she was finally starting to see the transformation she had worked so hard to build. And for the first time since that fateful night with the officers, she felt hopeful. The change was happening, slowly but surely. The workshops became a space for real conversations, where both sides shared their fears, frustrations, and hopes for the future. Slowly, the ice began to melt, and Tasha saw the beginnings of a new kind of relationship forming. There were still setbacks, of course. Not everyone in the community was open to the idea of change, and not every officer was fully on board with the new approach. But Tasha kept pushing, kept meeting with people, and kept advocating for reform. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when she doubted herself, when she wondered if it was all worth it. But with each new partnership, each new dialogue, she began to see the shift she had hoped for. Then, one day, a breakthrough came. Tasha received a call from a local church leader, someone she had met briefly during one of her town hall meetings. The church had been a central part of the community for decades, and the pastor had been one of the more vocal critics of the police department. Tasha wasn't sure what to expect when she picked up the phone, but when the pastor spoke, her heart skipped a beat. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've been doing, Chief," the pastor said. "And I think I owe you an apology. I've been one of the loudest voices against you, and I've realized that I was wrong. You're doing the work that needs to be done. I see it now." Tasha was taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "It means a lot to me to hear that. We're all in this together, and we can't make change alone." Over the next few weeks, the pastor became one of her strongest allies. He helped spread the word about the community policing initiative, encouraging church members to participate in the workshops and engage with the police in a meaningful way. Slowly, more and more residents began to get involved, and Tasha's vision for a safer, more connected Wilkinsville started to take root. But even as the community began to heal, Tasha knew the work was far from over. There were still voices of dissent, still individuals who resisted the changes she was pushing for. And there were still those within the department who questioned her every move. But now, more than ever, Tasha felt certain that she was on the right path. She wasn't just leading a police department, she was leading a movement, one that would take time to fully realize but was already beginning to show signs of life. One afternoon, as Tasha walked down the street near the police station, she noticed a group of young people gathered outside the local diner. They were laughing, talking, and enjoying each other's company, seemingly without a care in the world. She had seen them before, young faces that had once been at the center of protests and arguments, their frustration aimed squarely at her. Now, they were simply living their lives, a subtle reminder of the progress she had made. It wasn't a huge victory, but it was one she cherished. As she watched them for a moment, Tasha realized that the change she had been working toward wasn't just in the policies or the workshops, it was in the everyday moments. It was in the way the community was beginning to trust one another again, the way the police department was starting to view their role not just as enforcers, but as partners in the community. And for the first time in a long while, Tasha felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was enough. She had come so far, and the road ahead, while still challenging, no longer seemed impossible. There would always be more work to do, but Tasha was ready for it. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that real change takes time, and that even the smallest steps could lead to something monumental. The passage of time, as relentless and unpredictable as it was, continued to weave its way through Tasha's life, shaping her leadership and the future of Wilkinsville in ways she had never imagined. As the months rolled on, she found herself increasingly immersed in the process of transformation, not only in the police department but in the entire community. Yet, even as progress became more visible, Tasha knew that the hardest battles were far from over. It was one thing to gain the trust of individuals, but another to create lasting, institutional change that would stand the test of time. The challenges ahead were not only going to be external, but internal as well. One evening, after an exhausting day filled with meetings, protests, and community workshops, Tasha sat alone in her office, the silence weighing heavily on her. It had become a habit, this quiet moment at the end of each day, where she could reflect on her victories, her missteps, and the lessons learned. She looked out the window, the evening sun casting long shadows over the town. For the first time in a long while, she could see her vision taking shape, a more peaceful Wilkinsville, one where the walls of division were slowly crumbling. But the reality of her position was not lost on her. She was acutely aware of the scrutiny that continued to follow her every step. People were watching, expecting her to fail, waiting for her to slip up. And while she had made remarkable strides, there was still a long way to go. Her phone buzzed, dragging her from her thoughts. The message was from her mother again, a simple one this time. "Don't forget to breathe, baby." It was a reminder, one she had heard countless times before, but today it hit differently. The weight of the world felt heavy on her shoulders, and sometimes, she forgot to just pause and take it all in, the victories, the struggles, the growth. She had been so focused on the destination that she had failed to appreciate the journey. She had transformed herself from a young woman who had simply dreamed of making a difference into a leader facing down the impossible. In her exhaustion, she hadn't recognized how far she had come. Tasha stood up from her desk and stretched, feeling the knots in her back. It was late, but she knew there was something important that she had to do. She made her way to the precinct, where officers were finishing up their shift. As she entered the building, a quiet murmur of conversation settled. They had all heard the rumors, the whispers about the changes she was pushing for, the growing number of community partnerships, and the quieter rumblings about the success of the new initiatives. It was a slow transformation, one that wasn't always embraced by every officer. Yet there was a palpable shift. Some had begun to open their minds to the possibility that the old ways didn't always work, and that Tasha's new approach might be what the department, and the town, needed. Officer Daniels, who had been one of the most vocal skeptics of Tasha's reforms, was standing by the coffee machine when she entered. He glanced up and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but for Tasha, it meant the world. It was a subtle, unspoken sign that things were beginning to change. That things had changed. He walked over to her, his usual stoic expression now carrying a slight softness. "Chief," he said, his voice low but steady, "I've been thinking a lot about what we've been doing here. About what we've been a part of. And I just wanted to say, I see it now. I see the impact you're making. You're doing the right thing." Tasha smiled, genuinely touched. Daniels wasn't the type to offer praise lightly, and hearing it from him was a sign that the seeds of transformation were not only being planted in the community but within the very core of the department. It was a slow burn, but it was happening. "Thank you, Daniels," she replied, her voice quiet with emotion. "I couldn't do this without people like you. It's going to take all of us. One step at a time." As the evening wore on, Tasha reflected on the words that had been said to her over the past few months, the apologies, the quiet encouragement, the unexpected acts of support. She had never imagined that her leadership would be met with such resistance, nor had she anticipated how exhausting it would be to stay true to her vision in the face of constant doubt. But it was moments like this, when the people around her started to see the bigger picture, that made the entire journey worthwhile. It was a slow process, but it was progress nonetheless. The following weeks were marked by a renewed sense of collaboration within the department and the community. Tasha's work to rebuild the police department's relationship with the residents of Wilkinsville was paying off in ways that she had not anticipated. One of the most important programs she had introduced, the community response teams, was proving to be a massive success. This initiative paired officers with social workers, mental health professionals, and local activists to respond to nonviolent calls, something that had never been done in Wilkinsville before. It was a concept that had met skepticism from the start, but now, the results were impossible to ignore. Crime rates had begun to fall, and residents were reporting feeling safer, not just from the police, but within their own neighborhoods. For the first time in years, Wilkinsville felt like a town that was finally moving in the right direction. The officers were no longer seen as just enforcers of the law, but as partners in building a safer, more cohesive community. It wasn't perfect, there were still incidents, still moments of tension, but the shift was undeniable. And for Tasha, that was the most meaningful victory of all. However, with the successes came new challenges. As the department began to evolve, so did the expectations placed on Tasha's shoulders. More than once, she found herself caught between the demands of her department and the needs of the community. There were days when the weight of leadership felt unbearable, when it seemed as though no matter what she did, it was never enough. The pressure was relentless, but through it all, Tasha held on to the conviction that the work she was doing was worth the sacrifice. Every tough decision, every sleepless night, was paving the way for a better future, not just for Wilkinsville, but for every town that looked to her as a model of what was possible. Then came the moment she had been dreading, a major incident that threatened to undo everything. A local teenager, a young black man with a history of petty offenses, was stopped by officers during a routine traffic stop. The interaction quickly escalated, and before anyone could intervene, the situation turned physical. The video of the incident spread like wildfire on social media, igniting outrage across Wilkinsville and beyond. It was the kind of crisis Tasha had hoped to avoid, and now, it was threatening to undo the progress she had worked so hard to build. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and press conferences. The department was under investigation, and Tasha knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But as the crisis unfolded, she found herself leaning on the relationships she had worked so hard to cultivate. She spoke with the family of the teenager, assuring them that the incident would be fully investigated. She met with the community leaders who had supported her through the toughest times, explaining her commitment to accountability and transparency. She even spoke to the officers involved, urging them to recognize the impact of their actions and reminding them of the importance of upholding the trust of the people they swore to protect. In the end, the investigation led to significant reforms within the department: additional training for officers on de-escalation techniques, revised policies around traffic stops, and a renewed commitment to transparency. The community, while still hurt and angry, began to see that Tasha's leadership wasn't just about implementing change, it was about holding everyone accountable, including herself. The crisis had tested her in ways she never expected, but it had also solidified her place as a leader who wasn't afraid to make the hard decisions. As the dust settled, Tasha stood once more at the edge of the change she had worked so tirelessly to create. It wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that would continue to challenge her, inspire her, and ultimately define her legacy. She had been through the storm, and now, she could see the light ahead. Wilkinsville was not perfect, but it was better. And Tasha knew that the future, though uncertain, was a future she could face with hope.